Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
My name is Lou Palumbo. I'm the host of BetweenTheLines.tv. And I think if you just take a look at the country on a day-to-day basis, we are riddled with problems. All of these problems intersect because of one interesting reason, and it has to do with our children, their future, and ultimately the future of this country, which they represent. I recommend that you kind of participate in these discussions because they're more inclined to problem solve and less to ridicule. You know, we discuss any number of topics. We're going to get into one today, rather interesting, regarding gun violence with our young people. But we do speak oftentimes about the border, which I happen to think is the greatest, most immediate threat to our national security. And commingled in there is a conversation about sex trafficking, which is why we had a gentleman on from Phantom Rescue, an organization that is headed up by Frank Smith and Tony Sparks. I would encourage you to look into both of their backgrounds. Very interesting, but they actively participate in an exercise to, I guess you would say, perform some type of interdiction with the sex trafficking issue, which is happening all over the United States, not just the border. It's happening in families, happening on the reservations of the indigenous people. I do want to remind everyone about our sponsors, Buzzsprout and Instacart. We're going to get into them a little bit more later. But we have set aside some special advantages and offers for you. So we'll talk about them later. With that being said, we're going to dive into the show. Our guest today is a gentleman, Paul Boxer, a professor in the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University-Newark, where he also directs the Social Development Research Program, and he currently holds funding from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to study how youth become involved in gun violence. He's an expert in development and management of aggressive behavior and is currently serving on the expert panel for a national school safety and violence risk assessment project. Mr. Boxer was also part of a special appointment commission from the International Society for Research on Aggression that prepared a report on the violence in the wake of the high school shooting in Parkland, Florida. So I'm curious. I'd like to hear his point of view because there are, when you refer to our youth, it's a very, very broad stroke. Obviously, some of the youth of this country are engaging in these heinous, egregious acts of violence without purpose. Movie theaters, high schools, grammar schools, pick a place, malls, Walmart, you can just pick a place. And the common denominator to them, by the way, is mental illness or emotional upsetment. There is also another, I would say, demographic of our youth that are tied to our inner cities, and which you probably heard about all the shootings this past weekend. These are all kids. These are all young people. Memorial Day weekend, we had over 51 shootings alone in the city of Chicago, over 23 in New York. The reason more people aren't dying, by the way, is because the medicine's just that much better. But when you speak to what goes on in the inner city, it at times is turf wars or, in a sense, attached to what we call crimes of fruition, drug trade. So there's two different, I would say, motivators that push our youth in the direction of gun violence. And I'm curious to hear what Paul Boxer's take is on that. He's obviously has a quite a diverse background, and he's been involved in a lot of research and studies. And again, I want to just say this and the most constructive way. I'm curious to hear the assessment of how we got here. It's very, very important to the conversation, but there's an immediacy and need to stop these shootings in both the inner cities and in our learning environments. And if you really study what's going on in the learning environments, we're recommending that we harden the educational environments that our children learn. ballistic glass on the first floor and hardening the doors and putting in man traps and shot spotting devices that can triangulate the discharge of a weapon within 1 meter, hardening classrooms. That's what needs to be done immediately while we sit here and try to break it down and figure out how to get the genie back in the bottle, which is what I hope a lot of this research lends itself to. In reference to our inner city children, simply stated, you have to change their living dynamic. Education is this incredible tool through life. It takes guns off the street. It changes the paths of people's lives, especially young people. I oftentimes remind everyone about this equation. Lack of education equals unemployment. Unemployment equals crime. So this is going to be an interesting discussion. I am very curious to hear his point of view. I'm certain he's done his share of research, and as we've mentioned before, we're now trying to identify what are the denominators that are driving our young people into these mass shootings and learning environments. So we're going to go to a quick break right now, and when we come back, we're going to have Mr. Boxer join us, and I'm sure we're going to have a real interesting conversation. We'll be right back. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. Mr. Boxer is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University-Newark, and he's been involved in a lot of extensive, highly relevant research and studies regarding our youth, and in particular violence and gun violence, I would suspect. So I want to allow Mr. Boxer to speak to this topic and give us some impressions as to why are we in the shape we're in, Paul?
I had no idea you were going to start with such a broad question. Thanks for having me here. I'm happy to talk about all those kinds of issues. My work has focused on youth violence for quite some time. As far as why we're in our current situation, I think depending on what kind of scholar you ask about this, whether you're talking about someone who might have expertise in politics or economics or, English literature, humanities or psychology, you're going to get different kinds of answers. My view is that in terms of our current situation with respect to violence among our youth, I think there's a number of factors that the research would suggest are very relevant to understanding that. I think certainly, it's always going to be the case that things like poverty, food insecurity, educational issues, genetically based predispositions are always going to be related to violent behavior. But then you have to start thinking about, well, there's plenty of people born with certain kinds of genetic predispositions who don't end up engaging in violent behavior. So, what are some of the other issues there? And so once you get past kind of the inborn predispositional kinds of factors, and you have to start thinking about social, contextual, societal sorts of issues like exposure to violence. And we've known for a very long time that violence begets violence in the sense that kids who are exposed to lots of violence in the home, in the community, in the media, in their schools, they do develop the tendency to engage in violent and aggressive behaviors themselves. There's lots of things in society that stimulate violence. Seeing a violent act happening in front of you, seeing it happening on TV or in real life, being exposed to weapons, having access to those weapons, these kinds of things can shape down the line the propensity to get engaged in violent behavior. So the answer to your question probably couldn't fit into a podcast episode if we really went the whole distance, but there's a lot of different factors that you can point to that shape those ultimate behavioral.
Let me say this first. I mean, that was an absolute spot-on assessment as to what's driving this issue with our children. I mean, we can get failed parenting, to speak it in more simplistic terms, video games exposing our children to weapon systems and tactics, the entertainment industry, which changed the genre of movie in the 70s to action heroes, where the remedy to injustice is violence perpetrated and overcoming. I mean, there's a lot of factors driving this, all of which you've touched on, which is really interesting that you know what you're talking about here. The next question, Paul, is is there a road? First, is there a road back? And if there is, what is that road? And, after we speak to these topics in this manner, I think we need to speak to the immediacy of mitigating these threats on a daily basis. So I'm curious to hear what you think as far as if there's a road back.
Sure. And I appreciate your line of questioning in the sense that certainly it's very relevant right now to talk specifically about gun violence and specifically about what happened in Texas last week. or I guess, last week. But from the broader perspective of what a road back might entail, I think, in accordance with the fact that there are multiple causes for how we got to this point in the first place, there are multiple avenues towards solutions. I think if we go at the most basic level in this country, certainly we could talk about other countries too, to an extent, but I think we're unique in a lot of ways, both good and bad. I think we want to talk about ensuring that every child in this country has access to a free and appropriate and quality public education, that every child in this country has access to every single element of healthcare that he or she they might need to thrive and survive and do well. And I'm including behavioral and mental health care, and along with medical, physical sorts of health care. We need to make sure that kids have access to all the food they need to make it through a day feeling good and ready to learn, and all those kinds of issues too. So we're talking about basic needs in a lot of respects. Okay. From there, we want to talk about making our communities safer. There's a lot of different ways to do that. One way to do that is to ensure that when kids are having access to things like good mental health services, that includes things like universal prevention programs that are very easily delivered in schools to teach kids how to cope more effectively with stress, with conflict, with their peers, with frustration, with anger, et cetera, to make them, essentially, better citizens of the world.
Can I just interrupt you for a
sure.
second? I just want to caution you, okay? Because you sound like you might be solving problems here, which is a real departure from what we do in America every day. Unfortunately, Paul, these are the conversations that need to take place, and then the things we're speaking to be enacted. I say the same thing. We've got to invest in our communities. Interestingly enough, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, especially one politically directed, but we're pushing $54 billion towards the Ukraine. Think what we could do that in this country with programs that you're alluding to redefine the thought process and guidance for our youth. I want to ask you another question. I know you were speaking, but please indulge me.
Right.
I'm 70, so I know I got you by a few, and I lived and grew up in a different America. And I've been in the law enforcement community for 49 years. I'm a retired law enforcement agent. I've had relationships with numerous agencies. I've worked for our government. Guns kind of skipped along in the culture for about 220 some odd years with little or no incident. We did have an incident in Texas in 1965 or 66, and I think there may have been another one around 82. But April 20, 1999, we kind of turned a corner in Columbine, and it's like we never looked back. So we're hearing all the discussion about gun control. I like the word management because control alienates us. And clearly, the people that are pro-gun need to become part of this solution, which means it lends itself that you're going to have to give a little ground somewhere. Mm-hmm. I'm not just alluding to the fact that 18-year-olds shouldn't have assault rifles. That's a no-brainer to me. Or you shouldn't be able to buy a gun in a gun show without providing any identification and vetting. Our vetting process is deficient. I'm sure you know that already. Here's the question. Did the gun change or did the culture change? What happened, Paul? Who changed here?
That's an excellent question. And first of all, let me say I appreciate.
I did that on purpose, by the way.
That's a great question. Let me say, first of all, that I appreciate you acknowledging the fact that there are some very common sense sorts of legal interventions that could happen with very little effort, such as not letting a kid who's 18 years old buy a gun. Really, a gun of any sort. I mean, I don't want to try and offend, the hunters and the sportsmen. I know kids go out with rifles and shoot deer. I don't myself do that, but I get that perspective. But the fact that the kid who perpetrated the shooting in Texas could walk in and buy himself not one but two AR-15s after his 18th birthday was just chilling to me. So raising the age right away is a real simple sort of intervention, making it harder to access guns at gun shows, et cetera. There's some really simple, straightforward sorts of things. Now, I live in New Jersey, work in New Jersey.
And I won't hold that against you, by the way, because I'm from New York. There's a little rub.
If you want to. No. I'm ready to go there. I'm born and raised Jersey.
Okay, good.
I loved New Jersey.
I do too.
So we have some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. This is something my colleagues and I have studied, especially when you compare us to states like states in the Southeast, like Texas. And I'm sure at times it's probably frustrated some of the folks in the hunting community here, but in general, we don't have significant uprisings of folks who, love guns and want to promote guns and things like that. Things get along fairly well here in terms of, how the gun laws are implemented and maintained.
Yeah, we're not a gun culture, Paul. We're really not a gun culture. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut a little bit. Believe it or not, Connecticut was a Class 3 state. I still think it is, even after Newtown. Massachusetts has become less and less gun culture, but you're hitting on something very important. And I apologize for the interruption, but, my mom was from Arkansas, her whole family. And, the interesting thing in the South is these kids cut their teeth on fishing rods and firearms. So it's not unusual for a 14-year-old to go bird hunting or a 12-year-old. But this is a different type of conversation we're having. And I think in my opinion, what has to narrow down is types of weapons that are falling into the hands of weapons that you should be allowed to purchase at 18. In other words, an 18-year-old, in my opinion, can have a hunting-style rifle, a bolt action, load them one at a time, or a shotgun with an extended barrel for skeet or trap or bird. When you're asking me about buying high-capacity automatic pistols or these assault rifles if you so need, right? And it's a hard discussion today to tell people they can't have them, especially when we're witnessing what we are in the Ukraine, where we're arming their populace for the very reasons our founding fathers expressed concern: tyranny, foreign invasion. So the conversation, we're on the right vein of conversation, and it lends itself to what I had mentioned, Paul, about we need to start to give some ground. If you would just give me 2 seconds, my approach to this thing, and I went through vetting, is they should psychologically screen, criminally background, train, and educate to the law anybody who wants a high-cap automatic pistol, or if you think you so need this assault rifle. And in lieu of doing that, we would give a little ground because everybody wants to be able to protect their family. I got the memo. There's 800,000 law enforcement agents in a country of 335 million. That's a fact. So when you travel, you're on the road, you want to be able to take care of them. I want to give you that concealed weapons permit valid in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the U.S. territories. The same thing I have under what we call LEOSA, the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, Paul? Right. So I want to give you the same privilege, providing you comply with the same vetting. We have to at least start a conversation here about managing these firearms and how they get into the hands of individuals. I think it goes without saying, it's hard to understand why an 18-year-old would need, and this is the other part of this thing. The language of calling them assault rifles is alienating the pro-gun people. They want to have them referred to as sporter rifles, and there is some application for sporting, be very candid, and target. So I say we use this term AR-15 just to keep the peace on both sides of the street. But I believe you're right there, Paul. We need to have a conversation now about some intelligent concessions that need to be made. Would you agree, or do you want to continue to speak to that?
I agree with you, and I will continue. I think where I was going with that point was, and I would argue, by the way, that South Jersey may have some areas where there is more of a gun culture that resembles something happening in the Southeast than North Jersey, but I'm partial to North and Central Jersey. But in any event, I think that, one element of what you're suggesting that needs to happen is, to what extent, let's say you transplant someone from a state like Arkansas to New Jersey and say, okay, rebuild your gun collection here in New Jersey. Now, there may be a couple of extra hoops they have to get through to get access to those kinds of weapons, but I think in the end they would find that ultimately they can get what they need, right? But at the same time, we have other regulations in place that might prevent more problematic individuals or from accessing more problematic kinds of weapons. So I think, trying to draw some of the comparisons there and say, well, in Arkansas or Louisiana or whatever it happens to be, could we institute some of the same kinds of regulations that keep people safe in New Jersey in the same kind of way that it could keep people safe down here, while not, impinging upon, let's say, a legacy of a certain kind of orientation towards guns? But to get back to the original question you asked, is the gun changing or is culture changing? I think, as you just pointed out, in terms of the kinds of weapons that are available, the weapons are indeed changing, right? The kids in Columbine, if I'm recalling correctly, did not use AR-15 rifles. They used regular sorts of guns.
Shotguns, that's correct.
Had they been able to access AR-15s or something like an AR-15, I don't know what things would look like at Columbine. Columbine, it's interesting that you point to that. That really was the watershed moment. In fact, I was in graduate school at that time, and that was the single most salient event that occurred during my time there that really manifested in me completely changing the kinds of things I was studying and with the work that I was doing. So there was a watershed moment for me too in my own training. So the guns are definitely changing. The lethality is increasing. It seems like in some places it's becoming even easier to access them. I know the governor of Texas implemented some laws that made it less restrictive to access sorts of
constitutional carry. Constitutional carry.
Right.
Correct, sir.
So there were some changes that made things even easier. So, the guns and the regulations around them are changing. In terms of the culture changing, This is only one segment of a broader argument, but I would say that we are becoming, as a culture, more desensitized to the consequences of violence, to what violence looks like, to the extent that, I mentioned to my colleagues at the time after Sandy Hook.
I don't want to interrupt him on this right now.
Some of my colleagues, my more senior colleagues, were involved in working with Obama on that commission afterwards. But I said to them, if nothing happens now, if there's no federal action now to make things safer or deal with this problem in some way, we're not going to see any kind of action.
Yeah. Hold that thought, Paul, if you don't mind, sir, because we've got to go to a quick break, and I want to continue this train of thought. Guys, we're going to be right back. This is Between the Lines. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and we have with us, I'm just going to say, a very plugged-in, astute, keenly aware individual as to what's going on with our youth and our culture. He's speaking to cultural issues. And I would also tell you, almost alarming, he's giving us some means of solution here, which is a real departure from our norm, because all we have is a lot of finger pointing and rhetoric that goes back and forth. And Paul Boxer is biting into this whole problem of what's gone wrong with the culture and how to get it back in track. Because I hit him with a hard question. How do we get the genie back in the bottle? And you have to understand how we got out of the bottle, which he's identified, and now we have this road back. Paul, I do want to say one thing to you, because you mentioned about the lethality of these weapons. So, and I don't mean, this isn't an intent to correct you, but I want to just give you some timeline on firearms in our country. Cold firearms industry, the M16 was developed in the late 50s and early 60s. Eugene Stoner. AR comes from Armalite rifle. The military weapon that Colt manufactured was the M16. It was circulated for civilian consumption in the 1960s and skipped along over 35 years before we had an incident with one, to be candid with you. As far as high-capacity semi-automatic pistols, Glock hit the scene on 1981. They've been around a while, you see, and I do understand and I do agree with the fact that the sophistication, lethality of these weapons lends itself to a more effective mission, for lack of better terminology. But these guns have been around. HK's made high-capacity automatic pistols for decades before. SIG, CZ, I said HK, Glock. There's a myriad of these companies. So these guns have been in circulation here, but that's why I go back with that question. Did the gun change or did the culture change? My assessment, I'd be curious to hear your impression of my observation, is that the mental health of this country in general, not just our young people, has kind of slid. Your impression?
Well, that's an interesting question. I just spoke to a local reporter about that a couple of days ago. And let me just, I'll start responding by clarifying, first of all, that mental illness or, lack of mental health in general isn't something that we would typically say is predictive of violent behavior or risk factor for violent behavior. There are very specific mental health symptoms, primarily symptoms associated with psychosis, that are associated with violence. But in general, depression, anxiety, traumatic stress, ADHD, these are not conditions that we would ever associate with risk for violent behavior. They may co-vary with a risk. You may have someone who's dealing with some real significant psychotic kinds of symptoms that has these other issues too. But in general, mental health isn't something that is going to be associated with risk. Now, do we have a problem in mental health in society? Certainly, if you go by something like suicide rates in our young people increasing over time, yeah, we certainly do. I'm a father myself. I have 3 kids. I have firsthand observations of what happened during the COVID lockdowns and the social isolation that there was attendant to those lockdowns. Not just, it was stressful for my kids. It was stressful for their friends. It's problematic for lots of kids all around the country and around the world, I guess, too. So the answer to your question is yes, I do think we have a mental health crisis in this country, especially among young people, which goes along with all the things I was talking about before. We're in sort of an economic downturn right now. Things are very difficult for a huge segment of the American population right now in terms of the strains that people are being asked to bear. Is that manifesting in greater rates of mass shootings? Well, mass shootings, school shootings, like we saw in Texas last week, they're far too rare to tie to something like that. We know they've been increasing, since Columbine, of course, but not increasing at a clip that would allow us to directly pin some kind of mental health crisis directly on the frequency of those events. But in terms of other kinds of gun crimes, gun violence, what we see in some of our urban areas, even some of our rural areas, those sorts of things increasing, perhaps there's a correlation there.
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing is that the discussion regarding the violence being directed towards schools, academic environments, and movie theaters by people who are not stable is one discussion. What's going on in our inner cities is a whole different discussion. And I mentioned before, drug trade, gangs, things of this nature. Not to mention, and you touched on it, this whole lack of education. What I say needs to happen in minority communities is we have to eliminate the disparity in which they live, giving them education, giving them safer streets, better housing, better medicine, better diet, and make them believe America cares about them. We've got to start to turn the corner, and we're not doing it. Neither party is doing it, but it's fueling this inner city violence issue, coupled with the fact that I'm concerned that our elected officials have lost sight of the need of boundaries and consequences. We've thrown everything out the window every time we come to charge somebody with a violent crime in New York. We have a bail reform. They walk out. California is no different. I don't know what it is they don't get, but if you look at the condition of every major city, it's pretty much the same today. I won't get into the political dynamic driving it, but it's all young kids in these cities. It's interesting also, I learned this on the West Coast, Paul, because I have a home and an office out there. I ran some very big events and had some very big clients out there. A lot of kids in gangs outgrow gangs. You see them by the time they get 30, 35, 40, that thing that appealed to them in their teens and early 20s, it loses its zeal, so to speak. But, this is an interesting discussion. It's a very broad discussion also. But I think there are two separate conversations regarding our youth that engage in these mass murders that are not crimes of fruition, quote unquote, and that the inner city, believe it or not, it's highly likely that these are tied more to crimes of fruition. In other words, I think there's two different remedies to these problems. You agree with me? In other words, if we're going to get guns off the street and in the city, you got to police better. Maybe you have to saturate with police. Maybe we need to call in the National Guard for a short window of time, the way they do in D.C. every time their skirts get wrinkled. Maybe we need to impose curfews, things of that nature. The mental health issue is a whole different level of addressment, and that's the topic we're on right now. I'm sure you're aware of what happened with Geraldo Rivera and this expose they did at Willowbrook. And we dismantled Pilgrim State, Creedmoor, Willowbrook, and I think that resonated across the country. And again, I go back to government. The government needs to invest and stop spending money with Pakistan and put it into some type of program here that's going to change the course of this country, the trajectory of this country right now, overall, without going off into political tangents, the borders, the crime in the major cities, what it costs to live today. We're highly dysfunctional. So, let me ask you this, are there any laws in particular that you might recommend to address these issues? I mean, anything? And I know you're not an attorney. I realize that, and you're not a law enforcement agent, but I'm asking just your impression.
Yeah, nor a legal theorist. And you just put a whole lot on the table that I want to respond to.
Go ahead.
Let me respond to one point real quick. You made a point about violence in urban areas, and one potential remedy for that being more cops, different types of law enforcement authorities on the streets to patrol neighborhoods and keep them safe. Now, I understand that is across the board. I think in a lot of different sectors, you would hear that as a common response to, well, if there's a lot of crime and violence in the cities, then we should put more cops in the street. Well, that's one perspective, right? Certainly, and I've made this point numerous times when I've spoken to various groups about my research on gangs. The police know how to deal with gang problems. They assemble a large enough unit. They can roll through neighborhoods where gang issues persist. They can arrest everyone, lock them up in there. The community, you've taken care of all the problematic individuals, but at the same time, you've sort of hollowed out a community, right? No one, I think, is comfortable with the idea of huge regiments of police officers marching down the streets on patrols. There are ways to do directed policing in a very precise let's say, geospatially informed way that targets very specific kinds of areas with a more limited patrolling kind of capacity that can have the same kind of effect. But I would argue that if we're talking about crime writ large in these kinds of communities, I mean, setting aside for the time being issues of colonialism and white supremacy and racist kinds of policies that have created the situation to some extent in the first place, I think what you want to also be taking it into account, I know you're doing this because you mentioned education several times, we in a lot of places, we have hollowed out the public education systems in these communities, right? So kids aren't getting access to the same kinds of opportunities that their peers who are growing up in the suburbs or the exurbs or rural areas might have. So I think when, just as I said earlier, that the problem of youth violence is a multi-causal, multi-factored kind of problem, and the solutions will be as well.
I agree.
A sole solution to crime and violence can't just be, well, let's just put more cops on the streets, because that causes all kinds of other
Yeah, but let me just say one thing,
well,
Paul, and I hear what you're saying, and I need to be more specific and more pointed.
Okay.
My theory of saturating communities that are more prone to gun violence, for example, is not through stop and frisk, but through uniform presence, which is designed to prevent and deter. And the thing I want to say to you, Paul, we're at an extreme condition, and it's going to require an extreme response for a short window of time. I hear what you're saying, but this is what I've done for 49 years, and I'm comfortable in saying to you, I witnessed New York City turn blocks around. We used to have 4 cops between 8th Avenue and 9th Avenue on each side of the street, 8, right? And then the sectors were 1 square block. That's how we cleaned up 42nd Street, to be honest with you. That's a little bit of what I'm lending here in the minority community. I don't want to create an oppressive environment or a police state. I want to make the community feel safe, that kids aren't going to just randomly peruse the streets and your kids are going to be collateral damage, because that's what's happening. You know it and I know it. So I hear your theories, but I'm just telling you, I'm watching our government. Every time somebody squeaks wrong in the direction of Washington, D.C., we've got mutual aid from law enforcement agencies all around D.C., and we've got the National Guard. Why isn't what's good for the goose good for the gander? What has to happen, you see my point, in other words, and I think the conversation we're having is good, because now it's about being the architect and doing this in a way that's not offensive and doesn't exacerbate or further alienate the minority community. I'm with you 100%. It takes some IQ right now.
I totally hear where you're coming from. And I want to be very clear that I am in no way opposed to law enforcement being involved in this conversation and this solution. I've worked with various police departments over the years. I've had some good constructive relationships with our state police, with federal agencies. I'm all on board with the kinds of things that law enforcement can make happen. And I would actually hold up, probably as a national model, what's been happening here in Newark, New Jersey over the last several years. Rutgers-Newark, the School of Criminal Justice here, and some of my colleagues there have an extremely effective partnership with the city called the Newark Public Safety Collaborative, which is a data-driven, multi-sector collaborative of law enforcement, Rutgers researchers, community-based organization directors, local foundation funders, et cetera, who come together on a very regular basis to review crime data and talk about community-based sorts of solutions that are often implemented as a direct partnership between whatever precinct it happens to be and some local agency that might be working or have some sort of presence in that particular neighborhood, right? So let
me take a quick break, Paul. I'm going to bring you right back and let you finish these thoughts, guys. We'll be right back. We're back, and I have as our guest today Paul Boxer. The gentleman's a professor at Rutgers University-Newark. He's also been involved in social development research and program, currently holds funding from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, and he's just involved in studying the youth and guns and the whole thing, and he's got a tremendous amount of insight. He has a tremendous amount of knowledge, lending itself even to the problem-solving component of that. So before we rudely interrupted you with the break, I'd like you to continue your thought, and I know you can.
Sure. Just talking about the Newark Public Safety Collaborative, which is a multi-sector group based in Rutgers, Newark, where the city officials meet with Rutgers researchers and the Newark Police Department and various community-based organization heads to strategize using data. And that's a really key part of this, using actual real-time data analysis to strategize around what might be an effective solution for different types of crimes that appear to be, more or less prevalent. So my broader point here is, no, I don't know if I would necessarily support flooding a community with law enforcement, but yes, I would absolutely support that type of intervention if it's something that was developed in concert between local law enforcement and representatives of the communities.
Absolutely. You have to interface with the community. Absolutely correct. And primarily the churches. If you can get into the churches and get them into the streets with you, you can do a lot of good in turning that whole thought process. So, we're on it, Paul. Right now, we're on to the topic. Interestingly enough, Newark has been doing better. That's the truth. Camden, so-so. I have intimate knowledge of what happened in Camden. Baltimore shot, D.C. shot, Philly shot, L.A., San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. We can go across the country. New York, right up there as well. There are two separate, as I said, discussions. One dealing with the mental health issue that's driving our youth into committing these mass shootings. And then, of course, the conversation we're having right now about how to make the minority communities better. I believe we need to sit down and have a conversation and develop a tact to make the minority community believe we care about them, because there's no reason that they should believe just look at how many kids are dying every weekend in minority communities. And all we do is talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and it's both sides of the aisle. No one's stepping up to the plate and problem solving. And I just want to share one thought with you. I grew up in a minority community. I was born in Brooklyn in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Don't know if you have any familiarization with it. I was the only white kid on the block. So most of the children in my life, up to the point I was in college at St. John's University, were minorities. I've had friends, Jewish, Catholic, Puerto Rican, Italian. I'm half Italian, half Irish. Black. I've had everybody in my life. That's one of the things I love about New York. You're just saturated with all this different stimulus from cultures and ethnicity and religion. But I have a leg up on understanding how to get to this problem. We have to change that community. I think you'll agree with that. And the question is the methodology. You agree?
Well, it's a tricky question. The framing is tough. Talking about changing a community, changing a minority community. First of all, I would refer to them as communities of color. But as an aside, perhaps part of the issue is framing a community of individuals living in a particular sector of a city as somehow different or other, and not necessarily part of the broader picture, right? So it's not necessarily a minority community in the sense that this is a separate, segmented part of the population that is somehow something that we have to operate on and subject to different kinds of interventions. We're talking about people who live in the same community or the same town or the same neighborhood as you're talking about.
But Paul, let me say one thing to you, because I lived in Manhattan most of my life. The kids living up on 96th Street and above, which is where Spanish Harlem begins, they are living in a different community. And let me be 100% truthful with you. The people living on 72nd Street and Park Avenue don't want to look north. They don't want to deal with it. They want to keep it compartmentalized, which is what we do in this country famously. We did it with the indigenous people, and we're doing it with our minority communities. If it's important that the context of that term minority is not misrepresented. I just make reference to it to identify a demographic that needs help, period.
Yeah,
I understand your comment, though.
Yeah, and I understand exactly what you're saying. And the fact that you have, let's say, I don't want to get too much in the political weeds on this. I think it's easy to slide into that. I'm trying to be very empirical and science-based in what I'm saying. But you're absolutely correct in that the individuals who are sort of controlling, let's say, the political decisions that are made about where dollars should go and where resources should go are perhaps individuals who really don't want to necessarily coexist with the individuals that the dollars are theoretically going to help, right? So your point about people living up on Park Avenue West or whatever, thinking about what's happening in the Bronx or farther in Harlem, want to have sort of a separation there. And I think that's absolutely part of the problem, that we're not able to come together and
it's a gigantic part of the problem. But Paul, what astounds me is that we all know about it, and we make no effort to change it. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats. And I don't want to get into this whole political deal, but, I'm born and raised in New York City. The Democrats have done absolutely nothing for the minority community, because my thing is, this is an extreme condition. It's going to take an extreme response. And I'm not just making reference to, installing law enforcement presence or National Guard or curfews. I'm talking about massive commitment financially with bodies, all different types of bodies. Social service people, any number, medical people. And the sooner we do this, the quicker we're going to heal this wound. Look, Paul, that problem didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to get fixed overnight. And my attitude, I guess I have this little bit of police mentality to it. Come in and take it back a block at a time. And I know that if you demonstrate to the families there. There's a lot of 99% of the people in these minority communities are good people. This is 1% creating this optic of the minority community. I know this. I lived it. If we can convince them through an investment, not just money, but bodies, that we want to make their streets safer for their children, you want to win their hearts over, protect their children. You know, I love this country. We went to Vietnam to give them democracy. You want people to follow you, take care of their children. They'll follow you off the ends of the earth. I've watched our failed foreign policies here. We have a failed domestic policy here with our minority communities or communities of color, however we want to refer to them. But I think we're on the same page. I don't want to take off topic, but I do want to ask you about your perceptions of the video games in this country and its impact on our children.
Okay.
You got the floor.
All right. Well, as far as violent video games go, I won't comment about sports games and puzzle games and things like that, but it's the violent video games that often draw a lot of the attention. Let me say, first of all, there's been no study showing that playing a violent video game immediately causes someone to go and perpetrate some mass shooting or any kind of shooting. There's never been a study like that. There's been individuals here and there who will say, oh, the violent video game researchers say that playing a violent video game makes you violent. Well, there's never been a study that shows exactly that. But what we do have are studies showing that in the short term, in the context of, let's say, a laboratory study, playing a violent video game increases for some short amount of time, does increase someone's aggressiveness in the laboratory, their aggressive thoughts, their hostility, aggressive feelings and attitudes. The effects will eventually dissipate. But in the laboratory, we can show this. If you have someone play a violent video game versus a neutral video game, the violent video game play increases aggressiveness. We also know over the longer term, taking a longitudinal developmental kind of approach, that kids who are exposed to lots of violent media, violent video games, violent TV shows, violent films, over time become adults who do behave more aggressively than their peers do who may have had less exposure to violent media as kids. So the effect is pretty clear. What concerns me about this, and I was starting to go there a little bit a short while ago when you were asking me about the changes in culture, is that the violence level in video games in terms of what's depicted on screen, the graphic, gory, explicit nature of the violence that you can now see in a violent video game really concerns me, because we do have data showing that the more you are exposed to violent images, the more desensitized you become to violent images, right?
Obvious, common sense.
You no longer have the same kind of reactivity to it. Now, I'm sure you're aware of these kinds of factors and processes as a former member of law enforcement, right? So I don't think a cop could do their job if every time they saw someone who got beaten up or shot up, they had a very negative emotional reaction to it, right? Physically sick, emotionally sick, et cetera. So you, as part of your training or as part of your early experience, you have to become conditioned to being able to deal with those.
You numb yourself, right? Paul. What happens is you numb yourself to it. I mean,
exactly.
You just.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's the same kind of process. Now, it's not as explicit. It's not the real world. But what violent video games do is they are training kids to be with the level of graphic, explicit images you can see now in video games. It can have the similar kind of impact. There's research showing that. So that's what concerns me about violent video games. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question.
No, that's an exceptional answer. And the issue about the lack of data, how about we just apply a little common sense? If you understand anyone, stimulus oftentimes forms us. I have to tell you something interesting about myself. You know, I grew up in a very violent environment, period, end of discussion. I was boxing in the streets by the time I was 12 years old, like a boxer. It was my norm. It was my frame of reference. What the impact it's had on me is I just hate violence. I don't like guns. I understand our need for them, but I don't like anything that was designed to harm anybody else. You know, I went the opposite way of what the stimulus would make you, because I could see how you become prone based on stimulus. We're talking about stimulus here. It's basic, fundamental common sense. If you beat a kid enough times, he starts to think that's a relationship. It's the same thing if you look at parents. If the father's abusive to a mother, that's the frame of reference to the context in which the child lives, and he adapts accordingly. These are common sense questions. Listen, I want to, we're running out of time here, and I need to get you back on the show. I'd have you back next week, because I have to tell you something. This is probably one of the, if not, it's the best interview we've had, primarily because it offers solutions. It's giving us some path out, which normally all people do is beat each other's brains in rhetorically and never give us a resolution or a way out. So I just want to give you the last 2 minutes and see if there's anything you want to say further as far as information for us, or just the last word in general. You've got the floor, sir.
Okay. Well, I've appreciated this conversation as well. I'm glad you received it in a positive light. I think, and as I was listening to you just then,
Paul, why would I not?
well,
Were you
fair
skeptical?
question. Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I'll leave you with this then, because I was thinking about this as I was listening to you talk about your own experiences growing up. And I think about this every time I think about my own research and my own kids. So I've done surveys with kids in lots of different urban areas. I've worked in Newark, I've worked in New Orleans, Toledo, Flint, Detroit, different kinds of places. I've looked at data from other cities as well. Kids, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids, tell me on surveys that they've seen people getting beaten up right in front of them, that they've seen people getting stabbed, shot, that they themselves have been brutally physically attacked, that they can walk outside and hear guns being shot in their neighborhood. And when I see those kinds of data, I think to myself, first of all, I never had that experience growing up. And then I think, second of all, so far as I know, my kids haven't either. And then the third thing I think is, I don't want any child ever to have that experience, to be perfectly blunt. That's part of what motivates the work that I do. And so part of it, I think, is when anyone's having this kind of like political argument in the weeds about what should we do about this or what should we do about that, it's worth thinking for a second, could we construct a social policy for this country, a domestic policy for this country, a healthcare policy, educational policy that reflects what we would want for our own kids? And if we can get to that point in the way that we think about it, I think we could have a much more robust, scientifically informed, correct social and domestic policy for how we would want things to be. On average, most parents don't want their kids dealing with violence. On average, most parents don't want their kids even touching guns, honestly. So if we can work in that kind of direction, if we can think about developing social policy, science-informed social policy that would reflect what we would want for our own kids, I think we might make some headway.
Yeah, what's interesting is you're hitting the nail on the head. We're creating their frames of reference in the context in which they live when we subject them to violence. You know, listen, I have to be honest with you. Growing up, I went out to a park, you know, where my sister lived out in Nassau County. And, you know, when I was on a basketball court, you could throw elbows and bang it around, and I could play in my day. Long story short, you couldn't mouth off. If you did, you got clipped. So I'm out in the park, and this guy, you know, starts mouthing off, and I turn around, Paul, and I'm 14. I square off on the guy, and the kid looks at me. You know, that was my frame of reference. You could bang it all day long. You didn't say the F-bomb at the guy. You didn't run your mouth, because that's how you got smacked. And that's where you start to learn. I went like, man, this is how I grew up, but that's not how the whole world is. But, you know, listen, Paul, we need to continue this conversation, because this was very fruitful, which is a departure from the norm. You know, I know why you're doing what you're doing after this interview. And what I don't understand is why you're not sitting in Washington, D.C. in somebody's think tank trying to put this genie back in the bottle. But, you know, we've got so many problems today with this country, and I don't want to cheat it and just say it's just leadership, but we don't have any leadership on either side of the aisle. There's no voice of reason, no calm, no message of reconciliation. We're just rhetorically killing each other every day, and sometimes physically. And I don't know what the future of the country is. I mean, I'm watching the trajectory of this country, and it isn't good. You have young kids. The reason I stepped up to do this show, I told you how old I am. I need, you know, to take more on at this point, like I need a hole in my head. But this is about our children. It's not about me. Even you're a young man. I'm going to hop, skip, and jump through this thing. You're still working every day. You know, I have to tell you this. I have young children just like you do. My baby's 10. That's why I'm so invested in this thing. But it's haunted me. All of these topics that we're talking about have troubled me for a very long period of time, especially having the advantage of being born in a minority neighborhood or a neighborhood of color, quote unquote, and experiencing the disparity, witnessing it. It bothers me. And I don't understand why we don't make an effort to change it. And we don't. Like you and I did more positive discussion moving forward than our elected officials and the media do. By the way, the media are a big part of the problem today. So listen, I don't know how to thank you except to ask you to come back next week.
Anytime.
And we'll continue this conversation. I know you have a lot more to say, and it's difficult getting this all in 50 minutes or an hour, but I do want you to come back. I'm going to talk to Halfiel Molander to see if we can get your schedule back in to continue this conversation, because we're on a path of problem solving here, which is a real departure, as I've said before, from the way we operate today. I don't want to get political. I just want to fix these problems, Paul. You know, at the border, I know we need a migration process, but there's got to be method to the madness. You know, I know we have trouble in the inner cities. Let's not continue to go back and beat each other over the head. Let's just fix it. Let's go forward from here, not linger in the past. In any case, we are out of time, unfortunately, and I want to thank you. And I'm just impressed, to say the least, as to how plugged in you are. So, guys, this has been Between the Lines. My pleasure. My name is Lou Palumbo, and I got to thank this gentleman, Paul Boxer. He's been exceptional in this discussion today. See you guys next week.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.